Hello, this is UCL Uncovering Politics, and this week we'll be examining online death threats and asking how online platforms ought to respond. Hello, my name is Emily McTurnan, and welcome to UCL Uncovering Politics, the podcast of the School of Public Policy and Department of Political Science at University College London. This week's episode tackles death threats that are made online, and how online platforms ought to respond to this form of speech. Death threats, on the face of it, appear to be exactly the sort of content that an online platform ought to censor, or moderate, as the preferred and somewhat obscuring term has it. Surely it's impermissible to threaten someone's life, and surely it's appropriate for online spaces like Meta to remove such speech. But what if the statement isn't really an urge towards violence or a declaration of your intent to kill? Sometimes when people make death threats, perhaps to dictators, might that really be more of a political slogan or a form of critique? Is what matters how dangerous death threats are, or what was meant by them? And all online platforms care about this kind of philosophical nuance when thinking about what to leave up and what to take down. This week, to puzzle through these questions, I'm joined by two of my colleagues at the Department of Political Science, Geoffrey Howard, who is Associate Professor in Political Philosophy and Public Policy and the Director of the Digital Speech Lab, and Sarah Fisher, a Research Fellow. They've just jointly published an article on online death threats and how they should be moderated in a principled fashion. Welcome back, Jeff and Sarah, to the podcast. It's great to have you on the show again.
It's great to be back. Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Emily.
Let's start with death threats. What do we see online and who tends to be the target?
Well, I think death threats are unfortunately a ubiquitous feature of online discourse. It's pretty uncontroversial that death threats fall outside the protective ambit of the right to freedom of expression. No one thinks that threatening to take someone's life, at least in circumstances where it's reasonable for the listener to genuinely worry for their safety, is the sort of communication that's protected by free speech. And a lot of the platforms, unsurprisingly, indeed all of the platforms, have policies against this kind of rhetoric. So Meta's violence and incitement policy, which is the focus of our paper, encompasses death threats. It also encompasses within that same policy incitements to violence as part of a single commitment to ensuring that their space isn't one that is abused to promote violence in any way or threaten it.
Do you think this is predominantly a question for the online platforms or for the police?
My inclination is to say that it's both responsibility. So I think platforms have a special responsibility to ensure that their spaces are not abused to cause serious harm. I think it would be a dereliction of duty for platforms to say, our space is being abused by particular users to threaten death, and the algorithmic architecture of our platform is such that these posts are then going viral. But hey, it's not our responsibility. It's the police's responsibility. What instead seems to be what platforms should do is to remove that speech and then report the offending user to the relevant authorities.
That seems about right. And what's the normative problem with death threats? I mean, it sounds obvious because you threatened to kill someone. Is that the answer, or is there something more complicated going on when we're thinking through what's wrong about making a death threat?
There's a curious lack of philosophical attention to this particular question, perhaps because it does seem so obvious what's objectionable about death threats. I think we all have a right to live with a sense of security in our communities, and death threats, first and foremost, radically disrupt that sense of security by making it, in many cases, reasonable to fear that one is about to be harmed. Now, in many cases, you'll have what you might call coercive threats, where someone threatens on condition that the recipient of the threat do something in response to the threat. Those are, of course, objectionable because they violate our basic commitment to people's liberty. But even in cases of pure threats, where it's just a declaration of an intent to kill without any conditional, like, I'll kill you unless you do phi, even in those cases, it seems very clear that living under a death threat radically impoverishes the quality of one's life. It may incite other bystanders to engage in similarly threatening or violent conduct. Who knows? It may even, although it's an empirical question, turn out that threatening to kill someone increases the likelihood that the speaker will in fact carry out the threat simply by verbalizing it. This seems to be true with other commitments in life. So I think when we look closely, there's no shortage of reasons to think that death threats are really bad.
And yet, interestingly, your paper's conclusion is not never put any kind of death threat up and leave it up. So perhaps we can turn to the more complex cases of the death threats. Can we hear a bit about your central animating case in the paper?
Yeah, so the case we look at goes back to the summer of 2022 when a user posted in a public Facebook group the phrase "death to Khomeini," or in fact it was posted in Farsi. The user was Iranian. And so it was Margbar Khomeini. And so the group was one which described itself as supporting freedom for Iran. And this post also shared a cartoon of the Iranian supreme leader, Khomeini, kind of with his beard grasping a woman wearing a hijab, a blindfold and a chain around her ankles. And then a speech bubble next to the cartoon says, "Being a woman is forbidden." And then the user's comment, "Death to Khomeini," appeared underneath this repost of an existing cartoon. And so the question was really what to do about this speech. And what happened, in fact, was that somebody else on the platform complained about this post. So they contacted Meta, the parent group of Facebook, and their content moderation teams had a look at this case. It was actually reported as hate speech, and it was not deemed to be hate speech, but it was taken down by the platform on the basis that it was violating this violence and incitement community standard, which deals with death threats and calls to violence and incitement. So they took down the post. They imposed a strike on the user's account and various feature limits, meaning that there's certain things they couldn't do on the platform. And so the question we're asking really is, was that the right decision? Should they have done that? And that's the starting point for our paper.
And why maybe should they not have done that? What's the argument against taking it off if it's a death threat?
So the argument which emerges in the subsequent review by Meta and by its oversight board, its kind of Supreme Court body, which looks at its decisions and it's kind of develops judgments about them. The issue that comes out from that is this is said in the context of political protest. There are features of the Iranian regime where speech is quite heavily restricted, including online. So Facebook's actually been banned there for some time, and you have to use technical workarounds to use the platform. So it is a very important forum for people to be able to speak out against the regime. And so the argument that the user made when their post was taken down and that was considered by Meta and the oversight board was that this is something that's important to leave up as freedom of expression. This is exactly the kind of speech that we want to protect and allow.
So politicised death threats are fine, or death threats against political figures in the context of a protest might be the kind of thing to leave up.
So this is the kind of question. The first question, is it a death threat? And it's not entirely clear. So as we'll probably discuss, there's different ways of understanding this speech. It might be a rhetorical move. So it's not really threatening death. It's rhetorically criticizing the regime in this kind of hyperbolic way. So perhaps it's not a death threat at all. And that was actually what the oversight board concluded about this case. Then on the other hand, you might think, yes, it was a death threat, but it should be allowed in this particular case because of the kind of nuanced circumstances and the context in which it was spoken. And that's a kind of mitigating factor that means, okay, it violated the policy, but it should be allowed anyway because it's newsworthy. It's more likely to raise awareness of some really important issues. And that was the position that Meta took when it reviewed its case. So you've got these two different kind of thought processes going on by the two bodies. In the end, they both decided that actually this bit of speech should have been left up. So it was wrong to remove it. But they came to that conclusion for totally different reasons, which we thought was very interesting.
And to get us some clarity on how we should go about moderating the death threats and who was correct, the oversight board or Meta itself in its review process, your paper turns to the philosophy of language on speech acts, something that will be familiar to our regular listeners who heard the episode on the way that speech itself can act. So if a death threat is a speech act, what kind of act can it be? So it sounds like there can be different acts that death threats can be carrying out. Maybe we can talk through a little bit of that before we turn to your solution for the Facebooks and so on.
So saying death to someone, as Sarah has already pointed out, might constitute a threat. It might constitute the kind of speech that is either intended or likely to be understood by its listeners as constituting a declaration of an intent to inflict lethal harm on the recipient. Now, there's lots of different approaches to how you might characterize the necessary and sufficient conditions of what is required for something to be a threat. But the basic idea that we adopt is, what would it be reasonable for audience members to think the speaker was trying to do with this kind of language? And with a threat, it's reasonable for audience members to infer that the speaker is declaring an intent to kill the recipient. That's what a threat is. But as Sarah's been pointing out, it may be that in certain circumstances, declaring those words, death to whoever, doesn't constitute a threat at all, because it wouldn't be reasonable for audiences in those contexts to take the listener to be declaring an intent to inflict lethal harm. If the Meta Oversight Board is right about our case that we've been talking about, what's reasonable for listeners to infer in that case is that the speaker was simply hyperbolically criticizing the regime. And if that's right, then it doesn't constitute a threat at all. And so what we need to get clear about is, when we want to ban threats, so to speak, on social media, what exactly are we trying to do? Are we trying to stop the kinds of communications whereby it's reasonable to think the speaker is declaring an intent to inflict lethal harm? Or are we trying to stop the kind of communications that have the downstream effects of inspiring harm in the real world, whether or not it's reasonable for audiences to think that the speaker was trying to cause those effects? And this tracks a quite long-standing distinction in the philosophy of language between illocutionary and perlocutionary speech acts. I don't know if Sarah wants to give us a brief gloss on what is meant by that terminology.
Yeah, sure. So it's a subtle distinction, but I think it's one that can be grasped reasonably intuitively, and that's what we argue in the paper. Ultimately, you don't need this kind of fancy nomenclature, but it is helpful. Philosophers of language have been pointing to this distinction for some time, and I think it's one that we do need when thinking about content moderation. So the illocutionary act is, what are we really doing with our speech? It might be that we're thanking somebody, we're asserting something, we're asking a question, we're making a threat, we're criticizing. The perlocutionary act is what effects we cause downstream. So does it make you believe something different that you didn't believe before? Does it get you to take an action? So it's what effect does it have on the hearer and the wider situation? And so in our case, the illocutionary question, is it a threat or is it criticism? The perlocutionary question is, how likely is this going to lead to harm, lead to people actually trying to kill Khomeini and perhaps succeeding in that, versus how likely is it to raise awareness about some really important political issues?
So a kind of cost-benefit analysis at the end. Overall, is this speech going to have negative effects or good effects? Let's stick at the illocutionary question for a moment. So what kind of act is this speech act itself before we think about the effects of it? So your account of this puts the audience at the centre. So what can the audience reasonably expect to take this speech to be? A threat or a criticism? Is that challenging in the case of online speech? So I'm thinking here, what is the audience? The audience, is it people in Iran? Is it the global population? I guess this is an ongoing problem for online platforms and for people posting things online, is we don't really have a good sense of our audience a lot of the time. So what do you mean by audience for these threats?
I think it's exactly the right question. And I think what it illuminates is that the illocutionary status of a particular speech act will often be subject to reasonable disagreement, will often be indeterminate. It may be that one audience reasonably infers one thing, but another audience reasonably infers another thing. And so it's actually part of the core of our analysis that the ambiguity in whether something is or isn't a threat in the first place, which is, of course, the central issue of this particular case, calls for us to think through the different options there are for moderating online speech acts. So you might take the view that says, look, we want to ban threats from these platforms, and by threat, we don't mean any old speech act that might have a downstream effect of inspiring someone to cause harm. We mean those speech acts where it's reasonable for audiences to think that the speaker is declaring an intent to inflict lethal harm. And we want to ban those speech acts, whether or not it's likely or not that there's going to be downstream effects, in part because it's a matter of empirical contingency whether a given communication is going to have a downstream effect. And these content moderation systems aren't going to be particularly well placed to predict that, to make those kinds of predictions. The alternative view would be to go with a solely perlocutionary approach where we just look at the downstream effects and you stop all communications that are likely to have those downstream effects. The problem with that particular approach is that all sorts of intuitively protected speech might have the downstream effect of inspiring harm. So in the paper, we give the example of a celebrity who criticizes a particular politician or a particular company because she really doesn't like them. And it's not reasonable, we think, for the audience to take her to be either inciting violence or threatening the relevant entity that she mentions. But it might nevertheless be foreseeable, given the huge size of the audience, that some unreasonable listener is going to respond by engaging in violence. We think to point to that as a reason why her speech should be suppressed would just be incompatible with the principle of freedom of expression. And so our idea is that freedom of expression sits at the illocutionary level, if you will. And part of how we determine the bounds of free speech is by thinking through these different illocutionary speech acts, threats, incitements, harassments. And that's how, in part, we're going to delimit the scope of what is and what is out. But it does leave open this crucial question you've raised about ambiguity. And we do have a solution for that, we think anyway.
Well, then let's talk a little bit more about audiences. So is it the reasonable overall audience, or amongst the many audiences of this post, most of them would take it to be a criticism? So I guess the reason I'm thinking this is if, say, in Iran, it was taken to be a genuine threat, and the rest of the world thought, no, that's a form of political criticism, it looks like it would be most important the local context, how it's taken. Or not. This is the question, I suppose, that raises. And I think one further question I have about it is, in the case of death threats, you might think what matters is what the person who is threatened can reasonably take it to be. It looks like, doesn't their understanding of it trump anyone else's? Presumably one of the reasons we're most worried about death threats has to do with the effect on the person against whom they are made.
So I guess in practice in these cases, it's the content moderation team, these combination of automated review systems and human reviewers who are trying to work out what is this bit of speech, what's it doing. And so we're thinking about what's the question they need to ask. It's not feasible for them to always find out how the target understands this. They're going to have to take a view at some level of abstraction from that. And so we're trying to think, well, what's reasonable? What's a reasonable way, or what are reasonable ways to understand this? And sometimes that will involve looking at the context of the speech. So it was relevant in this case that it was posted in a public group, not a private group. So that means that the audience is potentially any Facebook user. And so therefore, immediately, as you've pointed to, there are going to be potentially different audiences spread all around the world who might interpret this in different ways. And so absolutely, the fact that these platforms are global raises this problem that there are likely to be diverse audiences and different reasonable interpretations. Now, that in itself is fine when the speech is perfectly benign, however you interpret it, or if it's perfectly not benign, so if it's definitely violating the policy, however you interpret it, then it's clear either you leave it up or you take it down. However, we think there probably are a lot of cases where there's a reasonable interpretation which would make it something violating, and a reasonable interpretation which would make it something important to keep platforming. And so actually we think this is probably a case just like that. So this particular use of death to Khomeini could be understood reasonably as a death threat, a genuine death threat, or it could be understood reasonably as a hyperbolic political protest slogan. And so we have as Jeff said, we have a solution for these kind of ambiguous cases, which we can talk about.
Yes, let's turn to the solution, because a nice feature of the paper is precisely that you seek to give really clear guidance to the online platforms about the principles they ought to follow when assessing these ambiguous or difficult cases. So perhaps we could hear about the solution.
So if it's just undeniable that a particular communication constitutes a threat, all relevant audiences, which is to say all audiences that are exposed to the communication, for those audiences, it would be reasonable to infer it as a threat. And that's basically the only thing it would be reasonable to infer it to be. We think for those kinds of communications, they shouldn't be allowed on the platform. And that's true even if it's quite unlikely that the target will be subjected to downstream harm. And the idea intuitively there is that it's just an abuse of the space. It's an abuse of the platform to use it to issue a death threat, even if the speaker is is quite incompetent or quite physically weak or doesn't have access to the requisite weaponry such that they're unlikely to carry out the threat, or if the target is particularly well guarded or armed such that they're unlikely to become victim of the threat. So we think that if it's undeniable that the communication constitutes a threat, you should take it down. Okay. Now, we're thinking now of these ambiguous cases where there are different reasonable interpretations of the speech. Now, in these cases, we think what you have to do is a kind of cost-benefit analysis where you think about, okay, it's unclear exactly what the speaker is doing here. Different audiences have diverging reasonable interpretations of whether the speaker is declaring an intent to inspire or inflict lethal harm, or instead whether the speaker is just hyperbolically complaining, whinging, protesting, whatever it might be. And in those cases, we do think you have to then turn to the empirical question, how likely is it that there'll be harm downstream? There will be some cases where the ambiguity is innocuous. So there's reasonable disagreement about what exactly the speaker is doing, but on neither interpretation is it going to be particularly harmful. But then there are going to be cases of dangerous ambiguity, but where one of the interpretations of the speech is truly problematic. And to give a different example than the one that we mostly talk about in the paper, think of Donald Trump the week before, or the day October. Think of Donald Trump, January 6th, telling his supporters, quote, "fight like hell," standing in front of the group of people, everyone watching on their phones, protesters already assembling at the Capitol as this riot is brewing. It seems quite plausible that there's some ambiguity in what Trump was doing there. It would be both reasonable to think he was just exhorting his followers to go and peacefully protest, but I think it's also probably reasonable to at least worry that he was commanding them to use violence. After all, he used the phrase "fight like hell." Now, in that kind of case, we think that, first of all, Trump has, and speakers generally in such cases, have a duty to be clear about what they mean. When one reasonable interpretation of your speech, even if it's not the one that in your heart of hearts you intend, is that you're exhorting your followers to do something seriously wrong, you have a duty to clarify that's not at all what you mean. And I think it's because you have that duty to clarify. And if you don't, you're not wronged when the platform, say in this case, intervenes and takes down that speech. So I think in the case like Death to Khomeini, you need to just look and say, well, hang on, there's reasonable disagreement about what exactly the speaker is doing with these words. Different audiences may infer different interpretations. And so you do need to do a kind of cost-benefit analysis.
The Trump case is provocative in this case. So it looks like the Trump case is different because he's literally kind of standing in front of a mob. It looks like the classic cases in the free speech literature where someone's yelling fire in a crowded theatre, someone's inciting a mob to go get someone. It's clearly a direct, dangerous act of speech in that we can see the harm about to appear. It's interesting in the case of thinking about online cases because I guess some people might think things like Twitter and even Facebook at times of politically heightened emotions in a certain way look a bit like talking to the mob, with pitchforks at the ready. And so you might think that nearly all ambiguous threats in any kind of tense scenario are much more like standing in front of the mob saying, go get them, than they are anything else.
I think it's a great point. I completely agree with that. And I think we tend to think that physical proximity is what matters. And I don't actually think that's what matters. Trump could have been at a presidential visit to Vietnam and been on the other side of the planet exhorting his followers to do this. And I think the analysis would be exactly the same.
So maybe those threats can't be made. In any case where there's heightened emotions politically, there's a kind of waiting mob. You shouldn't make any of these threats?
So when we do our cost-benefit analysis, it's going to be sensitive to exactly these kinds of considerations. So in a nutshell, when it's unclear what the speaker is doing with the words, the platform should step back and ask, well, what are the costs and benefits of shutting down and allowing this communication? In the case of the Death to Khomeini case, there's obviously public benefit in allowing vociferous, even violent protesting language to be aired against the dictator of Iran. On the other hand, there is a policy against inciting or threatening assassination on platforms. And so we do think you need to then analyze how likely is it that harm would actually befall Khomeini in the end. And what we do say is that we think it's Meta and the Oversight Board are probably quite likely that the risk of harm to him in particular was low.
And thinking about this cost-benefit analysis, one last question. I wonder about the range of harms you're thinking about. So as you're speaking, it sounds like you're very much thinking about the harm to that target, this particular case. Are you also going to wrap in harms to, say, the political culture? So the more hyperbolic threat-making gets made, the more likely it is someone pulls a gun and shoots an elected member of parliament. Is that the kind of concern that would get fed into the cost-benefit analysis? Or do you want to keep it very case-specific? What's going to happen in Iran?
I think that is pertinent to why threats are objectionable in the first place. And it wasn't on my list of reasons at the start. But I think the role of this kind of violent language in coarsening, corroding a political culture, perhaps if the violent language is directed toward members of a vulnerable minority, it may be that it isn't just the immediate target of the speech that feels intimidated, but members of a whole community. So I think absolutely these considerations are at the center of what we're thinking about when this language should be allowed and when it shouldn't be.
So it sounds like not many ambiguous threats are going to get through now. If they look ambiguous, they go to the second stage where we start looking at the risks. It's sounding like quite a lot of them are going to end up off the platform.
Well, we think this one gets through. So we think saying death to Khomeini probably should be allowed. Now, there is an interesting wrinkle that actually we don't discuss too much in the paper about why it is that the danger to Khomeini is low. And of course, the danger to Khomeini is low is because he's so well protected. But if you change the example, but I think this is a bit of the paper that maybe some more thinking needs to happen and maybe some future work. But if you change the example to like a female British MP, the fact that she's has to be really well protected by armed guards, perhaps precisely because she's the subject of armed threats, to then say, oh, the threat should be allowed because she's so well protected against them, when, of course, the protection is because of the threats in the first place. I think that deserves a bit more thought than we give it in this particular paper. I will concede that point.
So let's turn to the methodology of the paper. So it brings in philosophy of language off this really illuminating account of how these platforms can get a bit more particular and precise about what they're going to do with these kinds of acts of language. Do you think it's likely that the philosophy of language will have relevance elsewhere as we consider online moderation? So should platforms come and take a bit of a class in this kind of distinction making?
I'm not sure whether they need to take a class in this distinction making, but I do think that philosophy of language has got very useful insights to feed into this debate, because after all, philosophy of language has been thinking about offline speech forever. And there's been a huge amount of work to try and understand what people mean, what they do, what effects they have with their speech. And that applies, albeit in a slightly different environment, online. And so it would seem crazy to abandon all of that scholarship and think that this is an entirely sui generis new problem that we're facing. So I hope that this paper shows one way in which a distinction that philosophers of language have been making is helpful for thinking about real-world cases.
And this is part of the Digital Speech Lab's output. So and you're both in the Digital Speech Lab. So how does this paper fit into the broader frame of the project, and what's next for the Digital Speech Lab?
So the Digital Speech Lab is a group of us here at UCL working on this project funded by UK Research and Innovation to think about the governance of online speech broadly understood. And this is one very particular, some would say niche, issue within that broader inquiry. But we're thinking about all sorts of questions, like we've recently written a paper on whether Meta's policy of exempting politicians from its fact-checking systems is appropriate. We have work on the appropriate role of artificial intelligence in content moderation. We're thinking a lot about generative AI and synthetic media like deepfakes appearing on social media and how the platform should treat this kind of content. And really what we're trying to do is come to grips with this new digital public sphere in which we have a bunch of old forms of harmful communication that take on a different shape in the online context. And what we try to do is produce research that gives the relevant decision makers some insights in how they might deal with them.
And so there's a new shape on online context. Are death threats different online to offline? It sounds like the analysis is quite similar in both cases, except the audiences are bigger and more diverse. Is that the main difference?
And I think there's the potential for these communications to go viral, to reach, as you just pointed out, more diverse audiences. And so I think when you're doing the cost-benefit analysis phase, it will shake out a bit differently. I think some of this speech might have greater scope for harm in the online context, precisely because it tends to get amplified, precisely because people might find themselves in echo chambers where they're not exposed to the kind of counter speech that maybe they'd otherwise be exposed to. So there are features of the online space that call for further inquiry and attention. And it also just raises questions about these new intermediate spaces that aren't like traditional media. They're not like broadcasters, newspapers, television, cable news channels. They seem to be a new kind of phenomenon. And so there's a lot of foundational, I think, philosophical work to be done in theorizing what kind of entities are these platforms in the first place and what is their proper role in a democratic society. And that's part of what we're trying to figure out.
Fantastic stuff. Thank you so much, Jeff and Sarah, for that fascinating discussion of online death threats and online content moderation. This week, we've been looking at Jeff Howard and Sarah Fisher's article, Ambiguous Threats, Death to Statements and the Moderation of Online Speech Acts, which is forthcoming at the Journal of Ethics and Social Philosophy. As ever, you'll find full details in the show notes for this episode, and we'll put up a link to the paper as soon as it's available. Remember, to make sure you don't miss out on that or other future episodes of UCL Uncovering Politics, all you need to do is subscribe. You can do so on Apple, Google Podcasts, or whatever podcast provider you use. And while you're there, we'd love it if you could take a moment of time to rate or review us too. I'm Emily McTurnan. This episode was researched by Alice Hart and produced by Eleanor Kingwell-Banham. Our theme music is written and performed by John Mann. This has been UCL Uncovering Politics. Thank you for listening.